Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this headline flashing across every screen in America. China begins selling all U.S. debt. Markets freeze. Commentators panic. Politicians rush to microphones. And a single thought spreads through the public consciousness. This is it. For decades, Americans have been told a story that somewhere across the Pacific, a rival power holds a financial weapon powerful enough to cripple the United States overnight. That with a single decision, China could dump its dollars, crash the bond market, collapse the dollar, and bring the American economy to its knees. This idea has been repeated so often, it feels almost self-evident. $3 trillion, more than any other country. Enough to end American dominance. A financial nuclear option. But here is the uncomfortable truth. China cannot pull that trigger. Not because it lacks the will, not because it lacks the leverage, but because the moment it tries, it destroys itself first. What looks like a weapon is, in reality, a trap. And both countries are locked inside it. This is not a hypothetical scenario. It is not a future risk. It is the financial architecture of the modern world. And it is already in motion. To understand why, we have to dismantle one of the most persistent myths in global finance. The myth that China owns America, and replace it with something far more unsettling. The reality that America and China are bound together in a system where escape is slow, painful, and dangerous for both. This story does not begin with geopolitics, it begins with trade. For more than 40 years, the United States and China have been engaged in the largest economic exchange in human history. American consumers bought, China manufactured, electronics, clothing, furniture, machinery, entire supply chains. Every shipment crossing the Pacific carried more than goods, it carried dollars. American dollars flowed into Chinese exporters, Chinese banks, and ultimately into the balance sheet of the People's Bank of China. Year after year, trade surpluses accumulated, and with them, an extraordinary problem. What do you do with trillions of dollars? You cannot spend them domestically without destabilizing your own currency. You cannot simply hold cash forever and let inflation erode its value. And you cannot convert them into your own currency at scale without causing massive appreciation that destroys your export competitiveness. So China did what every large surplus nation has done throughout modern history. It recycled the dollars back into the American financial system, primarily through U.S. Treasury bonds. Safe, liquid, deep. The backbone of the global financial system. This was not an act of charity. It was strategy. By buying treasuries, China achieved three critical objectives at once. First, it preserved the value of its reserves. Second, it prevented the yuan from rising too quickly. Third, it kept American consumers solvent and spending. Cheap exports required a relatively weak yuan. A weak yuan required continuous dollar recycling. Dollar recycling required U.S. debt. This was the engine, and it ran for decades. By the early 2010s, China had accumulated more than $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, the majority denominated in U.S. dollars or dollar-linked assets. At its peak, China held well over $1.3 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities alone. This is where the myth was born, that holding debt equals control. That creditors rule debtors, that America, drowning in deficits, had handed its fate to Beijing. But finance does not work like personal debt. Sovereign debt operates under a different logic, and this is where the trap reveals itself. Let us examine the so-called nuclear option, the scenario that has haunted American policymakers for years. China decides to sell, not gradually, not strategically, but all at once. Hundreds of billions of dollars in U.S. treasuries flood the market. Prices collapse, yields spike. Interest rates across the economy explode. Mortgage rates surge into double digits. Corporate borrowing freezes. Stock markets crash. The dollar plunges. A financial crisis of historic scale. On paper, this looks catastrophic for the United States. And it would be. But paper does not show the second-order effects, the ones that matter more. The moment China begins selling aggressively, something immediate happens. The value of the dollar falls. Not slowly, violently. Currency markets move faster than bond markets, and China still holds the majority of its reserves in dollars. Not just treasuries, corporate bonds, agency securities, dollar cash reserves, dollar-denominated investments across the global system. If the dollar drops 20 or 30%, China does not lose that value gradually. It loses it instantly, on trillions of dollars. A 25% drop on $3 trillion is $750 billion. Gone. Not over time. Not amortized. Instantly wiped from the central bank's balance sheet. For context, that loss would represent a shock larger than the Asian financial crisis, larger than most banking collapses, and large enough to destabilize China's entire monetary system. And that is only the beginning. Because the collapse of the dollar does not happen in isolation. It feeds back into China's economy. China's growth model, even today, remains deeply export-dependent. A sudden collapse in American consumption would devastate Chinese manufacturing. Factories idle, workers laid off, social stability threatened. At the same time, a falling dollar means the yuan strengthens by default. Chinese exports become more expensive precisely when demand collapses. The worst possible combination. And while this unfolds, China's remaining reserves continue to lose value. Every additional sale accelerates the damage. This is why dumping treasuries is not leverage. It is self-sabotage. A creditor cannot burn down the house without standing inside it. This is the core misunderstanding. U.S. treasuries are not a hostage held by China. They are collateral China cannot liquidate without destroying its own balance sheet. That is the trap, and it cuts both ways. Because the United States is not free either. America benefits enormously from this arrangement. Cheap financing, global demand for its debt, the dollar's reserve status. But that status comes with obligations to maintain liquidity, to run deficits, to supply the world with safe assets. This is why American debt keeps growing, not because of recklessness alone, but because the global system demands it. The dollar is not just America's currency, it is the world's operating system, and systems do not shut down cleanly. This is why the relationship between the United States and China is not a simple rivalry. It is mutual dependency at a scale never seen before. Each side believes the other is trapped. Both are right, and neither can exit quickly without triggering the very crisis they fear. Which brings us to the most important question. If China cannot sell and America cannot stop borrowing, what happens next? Because while the nuclear option is a myth, the slow-motion version is very real, and it is already underway. China has been reducing its treasury holdings for years, not dramatically, quietly, methodically, diversifying into gold, redirecting reserves, building alternative payment systems, encouraging trade in local currencies. Not because it wants to attack, but because it wants to survive. And the United States sees this, which is why financial decoupling is so dangerous. Because there is no clean break, only gradual stress. And systems under stress behave unpredictably. This is no longer a story about China versus America. It is a story about a global financial architecture built on assumptions that are starting to crack. And in the next part, we will examine how this trap was created deliberately, why it benefited both sides for decades, and why escaping it may redefine global power in the 21st century. To understand how the United States and China ended up locked inside the same financial structure, we need to step back Not years, decades. This story does not begin with China's rise. It begins with America's victory. In 1944, as World War II was still raging, representatives from 44 nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The goal was simple: prevent another Great Depression, prevent competitive devaluations, prevent the chaos that had torn the global economy apart in the 1930s. What emerged was not just an agreement, it was a system. The Bretton Woods system placed the US dollar at the center of global finance, backed by gold, with other currencies pegged to it. America did not merely win the war militarily. It designed the post-war economy. For decades, this system worked remarkably well. The United States ran trade surpluses. It exported goods, capital, and stability. Dollars flowed outward, but they were anchored by gold. But systems evolve. By the late 1960s, America's role had changed. The United States was no longer just an exporter. It was a consumer. The Vietnam War, domestic spending, and expanding global commitments drained gold reserves. Foreign governments began to question whether every dollar could truly be converted into gold. In 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the gold convertibility of the dollar. The Bretton Woods system collapsed. What replaced it was never formally designed, but it became even more powerful. The dollar did not lose its dominance. It transformed it. Instead of being backed by gold, it became backed by trust, liquidity, and force of habit. Oil was priced in dollars. Trade was settled in dollars. Debt was issued in dollars. The world did not abandon the dollar because there was no alternative large enough, deep enough, or stable enough to replace it. This created a new dynamic. The United States could now run persistent trade deficits without facing immediate collapse. Dollars flowed out, but they came back, recycled through global markets, recycled into U.S. assets. This is the foundation of modern American financial power, and it is also the foundation of the trap. Fast forward to the late 1970s. China is emerging from decades of isolation. Its economy is poor, inefficient, and stagnant. Then comes a decision that will reshape the world. China opens itself to global trade. Not fully, not democratically, but strategically. It positions itself as the manufacturing engine of the world. Low wages, massive labor supply, state-directed investment, and crucially, access to the American consumer. This is where the system locks in. The United States wanted cheap goods to suppress inflation. China wanted growth, jobs, and foreign capital. Dollars flowed from American households to Chinese factories. But China could not simply let those dollars circulate freely. Doing so would strengthen its currency and destroy its export advantage. So the Chinese state intervened. It bought the dollars, sterilized them, and invested them abroad, primarily in U.S. government debt. This was not ideological alignment. It was mechanical necessity. This arrangement became known among economists as the global imbalances. America consumed. China saved. America ran deficits. China ran surpluses. And the financial system smoothed over the imbalance. But smoothing does not eliminate tension. It postpones it. By the early 2000s, this structure had become enormous. China's reserves exploded. American borrowing accelerated. Interest rates remained low, asset prices soared, housing boomed, consumption expanded beyond income growth. And then, in 2008, the system cracked. The global financial crisis was not caused by China, but it revealed something crucial. When the system was threatened, China did not sell U.S. debt. It bought more. At the height of the crisis, as confidence in American finance wavered, China increased its treasury holdings. Why? Because there was nowhere else to go. European debt was unstable, emerging markets were risky, gold was too small. U.S. treasuries remained the only asset large enough to absorb China's reserves without imploding. This was the moment the myth should have died, the moment it became clear that China was not holding a weapon. It was holding an insurance policy it could not cash in. From that point on, the relationship shifted subtly. China began to understand the vulnerability of overexposure. The United States began to understand the geopolitical implications of financial interdependence. Both sides started planning for a future where trust could not be assumed. China diversified cautiously. Gold reserves increased. Infrastructure investments expanded abroad. Bilateral trade agreements bypassed the dollar where possible. The United States responded differently. It doubled down on the dollar's dominance, expanding financial markets, strengthening sanctions regimes, using access to the dollar system as a geopolitical tool. This is where the relationship turned strategic. Because when finance becomes a weapon, dependence becomes dangerous. Yet dependence could not be unwound quickly. The sheer scale of the system made sudden change impossible. Every attempt to move away from the dollar carried costs. For China, abandoning treasuries meant reserve losses and export disruption. For the United States, losing foreign buyers meant higher interest rates and fiscal strain. So both sides moved slowly, incrementally. And this slow movement is why the system appears stable. But stability is not the same as health. Over time, something else began to change. America's debt grew faster than its economy, not because of a single administration, but because the system incentivized it. Global demand for dollars required global supply of debt, and U.S. treasuries became that supply. China, meanwhile, faced internal pressures: an aging population, rising wages, slowing growth. The export-led model became harder to sustain. Yet the reserves remained, trapped between necessity and risk. This is the paradox of the current moment. China wants to reduce its exposure to the dollar, but every step it takes must be slow enough not to collapse the value of what it already holds. The United States benefits from dollar dominance, but every use of financial power accelerates the search for alternatives. Both sides are acting rationally, and that is precisely why the trap persists. No one is making a dramatic mistake. They are making cautious decisions in an inflexible system. This is why predictions of sudden collapse are almost always wrong. The real danger is gradual erosion. Trust decays. Alternatives grow. Fragmentation increases, not with a crash, with drift. And drift changes everything. In the next part, we will examine how this slow-motion financial standoff affects ordinary Americans directly. Their wages, their savings, their cost of living. And why this global trap is no longer an abstract geopolitical issue, but a domestic one. For most Americans, the global financial system exists only in headlines. Trade wars, debt ceilings, currency crises halfway across the world. It feels distant, abstract. But the trap binding the United States and China is not theoretical. It reaches directly into American households, into wages, into mortgages, into retirement accounts, into the cost of simply living an ordinary life. The dollar's dominance is often described as an unambiguous advantage. And in many ways, it is. It allows the United States to borrow cheaply. It keeps interest rates lower than they would otherwise be. It gives American financial markets unparalleled depth and liquidity. But no privilege comes without a price. And the price of issuing the world's reserve currency is distortion. The first distortion is consumption, because when the world demands your currency, you can buy more than you produce. For decades, Americans have lived beyond the productive capacity of the domestic economy. Not individually reckless, structurally enabled. Cheap imports suppressed inflation. Foreign capital financed deficits. Asset prices rose faster than wages. This felt like prosperity, but it changed incentives. Manufacturing hollowed out. Supply chains stretched, dependence grew, and when shocks arrived, fragility was exposed. The second distortion is debt. Global demand for dollars requires global supply of dollar-denominated assets. Primarily, U.S. Treasury bonds. This creates a perverse incentive. The more the world relies on the dollar, the more debt the United States must issue. Not because of mismanagement alone, but because the system requires it. Foreign central banks, sovereign funds, and institutions need safe, liquid assets. Only the United States can provide them at scale. This has turned American debt into global infrastructure, and infrastructure is difficult to dismantle. The result is a debt trajectory that feels alarming, but persists, not because collapse is imminent, but because adjustment is slow. Interest rates stay lower than fundamentals suggest. Deficits expand without immediate consequence. This creates complacency until something shifts. The third distortion is inflation. For years, globalization exported inflation abroad. Cheap labor and global competition kept prices down. But that era is ending. China's wages have risen. Supply chains are being reconfigured. Geopolitical friction has increased costs. At the same time, trillions of dollars created during crises have entered the system. When global savings recycle into U.S. assets, they inflate prices. Not always consumer prices. Asset prices, housing, stocks, education, healthcare. This is why inflation feels uneven. Why official numbers do not match lived experience. Because inflation has been absorbed by assets, the things Americans need but cannot substitute. And now, as the system strains, consumer inflation emerges too. The fourth distortion is monetary policy. The Federal Reserve is often described as independent. Technically, it is. But independence does not mean isolation. Every interest rate decision reverberates globally. Raising rates strengthens the dollar. A stronger dollar strains foreign borrowers. Financial stress spills back into U.S. markets. This is why monetary tightening is cautious. Why normalization is slow. The Federal Reserve does not just manage the American economy. It manages the global dollar system, and that responsibility constrains its choices. Now consider China's role in this. As China slowly reduces its treasury holdings, the effect is not dramatic. There is no collapse. But marginal buyers change. Domestic investors absorb more debt. The Federal Reserve intervenes more frequently. Interest rates become more sensitive. This is not a crisis. It is a shift, and shifts alter who bears the cost. More debt held domestically means Americans bear more risk. Through taxes, through inflation, through financial repression. This is why the idea that China funds America is misleading. China helped build the system, but Americans increasingly finance it themselves, through their savings, through their pensions, through the purchasing power of their wages. This is the quiet transfer. Now consider geopolitics. The dollar's dominance has become a tool of statecraft. Sanctions, financial exclusion, access denial. These tools are powerful, and they are used. But every use carries a consequence. Each sanction accelerates the search for alternatives. Each exclusion encourages redundancy. No single alternative can replace the dollar today. But fragmentation does not require replacement. It requires erosion. Trade settled in other currencies. Reserves diversified. Payment systems duplicated. None of this ends the dollar's role. But it reduces its exclusivity. And exclusivity is where privilege lies. For Americans, this means a future that is less forgiving. Borrowing costs more. Consumption adjusts downward. The margin of error shrinks. This does not mean decline is inevitable, but it does mean adjustment is unavoidable. And adjustment always feels like loss. This is the political challenge. The benefits of dollar dominance were diffuse and invisible. The costs of its erosion are concentrated and immediate, which makes honest discussion difficult. Now we arrive at the central tension. China cannot dump the dollar without destroying itself. The United States cannot weaponize the dollar indefinitely without undermining its foundation. Both are trapped by success. Both are constrained by scale. And both are moving slowly toward a less stable equilibrium. This is not a coming collapse. It is a transition. And transitions reward preparation. The question is not whether the dollar will disappear. It will not. The question is how its role will change. From dominance to leadership. From exclusivity to centrality. and whether that change is managed deliberately or forced by crisis. For Americans, this means rethinking assumptions that cheap goods are permanent, that low rates are guaranteed, that deficits do not matter. They mattered less until they matter more. The next part is where we confront the future. What realistic scenarios look like, what does not happen, and what quietly does. And what this means for individuals navigating a system that is changing, slowly but relentlessly. At this point, it becomes tempting to search for a decisive ending, a moment when one side finally wins, when China sells, when the dollar collapses, when a new order replaces the old. That instinct is understandable. Stories feel complete when they end in rupture. But the real world, especially the financial world, rarely offers that kind of clarity. What it offers instead is drift, slow, compounding change that feels harmless in any single year, yet transforms everything over a generation. That is the future facing the United States and China. Not a dramatic break, a gradual rebalancing inside a system that neither side can afford to abandon outright. So let us be precise about what will not happen. China will not suddenly dump trillions of dollars in U.S. treasuries. Not tomorrow, not next year, not in secret, not in public. Any such move would instantly collapse the value of China's remaining reserves, destabilize its currency, and trigger internal economic shock far more severe than any damage inflicted abroad. This is not speculation. It is arithmetic. At the same time, the United States will not suddenly lose the dollar's reserve status. There is no rival currency capable of absorbing global demand at comparable scale. No financial market as deep, as liquid, or as trusted. Predictions of imminent dollar collapse have circulated for decades. They have always been wrong. Because reserve currencies do not disappear overnight, they erode. And erosion is subtle. What will happen instead is already happening. China will continue to reduce exposure at the margins, not as an attack, as insurance. It will diversify reserves slowly, increase gold holdings, settle more trade in local currencies, build alternative payment rails. Each step will be small, deliberately non-disruptive, because disruption hurts the holder as much as the issuer. The United States, meanwhile, will continue to rely on the dollar's central role, financing deficits, stabilizing markets in crises, using financial access as a tool of influence. But each use carries a cost. Every sanction signals risk to holders. Every political standoff reminds the world that neutrality is conditional. And so the system evolves, not toward collapse, toward fragmentation. In such a world, the dollar remains central, but less singular. Still dominant, but more constrained. Leadership replaces supremacy, and for Americans, this distinction matters. Because supremacy allows mistakes without consequence. Leadership does not. A less forgiving system demands discipline, higher borrowing costs over time, greater sensitivity to inflation, more pressure on fiscal choices. None of this means impoverishment. It means adjustment. The end of an era where benefits were invisible and costs deferred. Now, let us address the most important implication. This story is often framed as a geopolitical chess match. But it is not primarily about governments. It is about structure, a global system built on imbalances that once served everyone, and now strain everyone. China's export-driven growth relied on American consumption. American consumption relied on cheap imports and cheap credit. Each side optimized locally. Together, they created a global equilibrium that felt stable until it didn't. The danger is not that this system breaks. The danger is that it persists too long without reform. Because systems optimized for a past reality struggle to adapt to a new one. Demographics change. Technology reshapes labor. Energy transitions alter trade. And yet the financial architecture remains anchored to assumptions made decades ago. That the United States will always consume more than it produces. That China will always save more than it consumes. That global trust will always converge on one currency. These assumptions are weakening, not collapsing. Weakening. Which is why the next decade will not be defined by crisis headlines. It will be defined by friction, trade disputes, currency volatility, higher baseline inflation, more frequent financial interventions, none individually catastrophic, collectively transformative. For individuals, this means something uncomfortable. You cannot insulate yourself completely. You can only understand the forces at play. Understanding does not eliminate risk, but it changes posture. It replaces panic with perspective, and perspective is the most valuable asset in periods of transition. Now let us return to the original myth, that China owns America through its debt, that America is beholden to a foreign creditor. This framing is emotionally satisfying. It suggests a simple power hierarchy. But it is wrong. What exists instead is mutual constraint. China cannot sell without losing. America cannot default without imploding its own system. Both are disciplined by scale, and that discipline is what has kept the system intact for so long. The real question, then, is not who holds the weapon. It is whether the weapon can ever be used. And the answer is no, because it is pointed inward. This realization changes how we interpret headlines. Trade wars become signals, not solutions. Tariffs become bargaining tools, not cures. Currency rhetoric becomes theater, not strategy. The real adjustments happen quietly, in reserve composition, in settlement mechanisms, in regulatory alignment, and they take years, sometimes decades. This is why patience matters. Now, a final thought. Every generation inherits a system it did not design, and every generation decides, consciously or not, whether to understand it. The global dollar system has shaped American prosperity more than any policy debate. Yet most people engage with it only through anxiety, fear of debt, fear of foreign power, fear of collapse. Fear is understandable, but it is also limiting, because fear simplifies, and this system cannot be understood through simplification. It requires nuance, historical context, structural thinking, and a willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths. If this analysis has done anything, it is this. It has replaced a frightening myth with a more demanding reality. A reality where power is constrained, not absolute. Where outcomes are shaped by incentives, not intentions. Where the future is not predetermined, but negotiated slowly through structure. That understanding does not promise comfort, but it offers clarity. And clarity is what allows societies to adapt without panic. If you found value in this exploration, not as entertainment, but as understanding, then engaging with it is not a favor to a creator. It is a signal that serious analysis still matters, that complexity deserves attention, that long-form thinking has a place in a world of shortcuts. A thoughtful comment is not applause. It is participation in a conversation that rarely happens in public. A like is not agreement. It is a quiet vote for depth over noise. And if there is one person in your life, just one, who enjoys challenging ideas rather than consuming headlines, who would argue with you about this rather than accept it passively, that is the person this should be shared with. Not to persuade, but to think together. Because the systems that shape our lives do not change through outrage. They change when enough people understand them well enough to demand something better. And understanding, once gained, has a way of spreading, quietly, relentlessly. just like the forces we've been discussing.